Okay, so in today's episode of Hey, That's Not the Blackmagic Pixis, I decided to try something that I haven't tried before. There's kind of a first time for everything, and one camera brand I actually have never used before is Nikon. But in today's video, I'm going to talk about my first impressions, my experience using the Nikon Z6III and the Nikon ZF. Now, as far as disclaimers go, also autofocusing test on the 24-70 on the Nikon Z6III. Envato's going to be the sponsor of this video. Now, Nikon did send me both of these cameras. I got to keep them. I don't have to give them back. They're effectively going to be mine. So at best, these are more overview videos and a little bit of a series. However, the sponsor of this video is going to be Envato. It's a great way to actually speed up your editing workflow. There's a bunch of different assets, which we will talk about a little bit later, but I think for transparency's sake, calling this a review and telling you that you should buy this is going to be up to the information in this video and whether or not it matches your needs. However, Nikon lets me keep the Z6III and the Nikon ZF in this video. Also, yes, I'm a Maui. But I did mention on Threads a little while ago that I haven't used a Nikon system, and then Nikon decided to not only reply, but they also sent me the Nikon Z6III and the Nikon ZF. Full disclosure, they let me keep both of the cameras, so the most I can give you is an overview and a first impressions. However, I want to talk to you not necessarily about the specs, but I've been using it over the last couple of weeks, and I just want to talk about that experience, because if you want a spec video, they already exist. This camera's been out for a while, but I just want to talk about my first time using a Nikon camera. We'll get there. Okay, so first things first, I'm going to talk about the Nikon Z6III in terms of the build and kind of what it looks like. And to be honest with you, it looks like a hybrid camera that Nikon makes. Now, in terms of how the camera actually looks, I'm probably going to rig up the Z6III for the rest of this video, but it looks very much how I would expect a Nikon camera to look. Now, Nikon's had a very strong brand in photography a long time, so their mirrorless cameras kind of look like their DSLR cameras as well. What's nice about this camera is that you can shoot CF Express Type B and you can shoot SD as well, which has a little bit of a caveat to it. I do know the Z mount is one of the shortest flange distances, so you can theoretically adapt it to anything, but I will call this my Australia mount, because in order to mount on the lens, you have to turn it the opposite way, which is a little bit weird to do the first time, but it's nor here nor there. It's just something that I noticed. Now, this mid-range hybrid also does have 2 custom buttons on the front and a couple throughout the body, which is nice because even at that less than $3,000 hybrid camera, you do have a couple of custom options as well. You also are going to get an articulating screen that kind of comes out the same way other cameras do as well, so if you do want to use this as a vlogging camera or content creation camera, you absolutely can, especially because you could shoot 6K raw at 60 frames a second, which we're going to show later on in this video. I also like keeping the strong culture in its photography. You do have some of the buttons that kind of look like they'd be used for photography cameras as well. I could zoom in and I could zoom out on my footage or my photos. I also have a joystick as well so I can move my focus point. And what's nice is that it has a photo and a video switch. Now in today's video, I'm mostly going to talk about video features on the Z6III because I'm also just going to use the Nikon ZF in terms of photography. What's also nice is you get a full-size HDMI and you get a headphone jack and a microphone jack as well. So if you want to use this as a video production tool, you absolutely can. But let's go into some of the things we actually use the camera for, some of the quirks and caveats, and also how I found some of the footage. Now the Nikon ZF is something I would call same but different. Now, other mirrorless cameras, including the Nikon Z6III, they're meant to be work tools. They look and they feel like work tools, which is perfect because, well, that's kind of what their intention is. But the Nikon ZF has a special sauce to it. Now, I did add some of my own accessories, which I'll talk about a little bit later when we talk about the setups and the rigs for these guys. But one of the things that's really nice about this is, one, it passes the hand test when I use a grip. And 2, it does have some of that old film camera aesthetic. It does have manual dials at the top. So you can change things like your shutter speed and your ISO by just kind of doing that a bunch. Now, I do like that this does have a fully articulating screen just in case I want to use it for video, which it absolutely can do in 4K. Maybe I'll just switch the functions over on these 2 cameras in a later video, but overall, in terms of the aesthetic with this guy and the photography to match, I like the Nikon ZF because it has a special sauce, it has a special character to it, and I've also had a lot of fun shooting photography on this, which we're definitely going to talk about later on in this video. Now, because my X-Men Mutant power is to have gigantic hands, I'm going to have to add a couple accessories to both of these cameras, which we're going to go into what the rigs look like. Every kiss begins with K, and every rig begins with a cage. And it's pretty solid. Now, what I'm also going to use here is going to be this kind of micro V-mount battery plate on here. The reason being is that I don't need a gigantic setup. I actually don't need rod support for the setups and rigs I'm going to be running with this and how I'm going to use the Nikon Z6III. This is super easy because this on its own can kind of sit over here. And then I just have to screw in this little bottom plate on the bottom of the Nikon Z6III in order to make sure that everything is nice and secure. Also, this battery plate has like a little locking mechanism on the bottom here. So instead of having to screw this part in, once we're locked in, it's pretty decent. Although, I should probably tighten that. It probably shouldn't be shaken. Just tighten that part in. We're pretty decent. I am going to be using Caleb Pike's VB212. This is a pretty big battery for this setup. However, in a car break-in, I kind of lost my other battery. So this is the guy we're going to be using. Once that is set, this is super dirty because we're in the future. We're in future Kofi right now. Actually, I'm going to clean that up real quick. All right, so this is what the rig looks like with a VMAP battery attached. This has a VB212, the small rig plate, and we're looking pretty decent. Now I'm also gonna mount this small rig top handle. This has a monitor mounting as well. It's pretty easy to do. It just kind of goes into 3 5/8. And I'm just gonna put this on the top here. I'm also gonna leave a link in the description for everything. So that way, if you guys wanna pick something up, you definitely can. Now on here, I am gonna use my old faithful. This is the Automotive Ninja 5. I've had this for like almost 4.5 years, or almost 4 years at least. And this is also gonna come in handy because it does have an SSD at the back. So if I wanna record any of the menu settings in order to test things like autofocus, for my tests, my run and gun shoots, when I wanna kind of mirror the monitor onto here and the camera can't do that natively or through a phone app, this is what I'm going to use. So this is how we're looking so far. Things are looking pretty decent. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to hook up an HDMI cable to this guy, and also I want to make sure that I have the proper clamp for it. So this is going to come down here. I'm going to put that in. That is going to go HDMI in. And you also get a little clamp over here for the small rig cage. In retrospect, I probably should have put the cage on first. And then that tightens things up, keeps my cable nice and secure. Put that flap over here, and we're good to go on that front. Audio-wise, I am gonna be using the MKE, I believe this is the MKE 400. This is gonna be my microphone of choice. You only have 3.5mm jack on the Nikon Z6III, which I would expect from a hybrid camera. This is super nice, goes right into this little cold shoe on this small rig cage. Only funny part is I gotta take all these flaps out, which, I mean, I guess isn't the worst thing in the world, but you do have to kind of be aware of what you're doing while you're doing this. Okay, so microphone, cage are all set up. Now, for a lot of the tests, I am going to be shooting things in anamorphic, so I am using my Blazer Remus 65mm. I also have a PL to Z mount adapter by Latretter, and I'm using my Peter McKinnon VND filter when I actually need it. Now, for some of the first shoots that we're going to do, I'm not going to need this guy, but this comes in handy, as well as using another filter, which we'll talk about when I talk about the ZF build. And there we have it. This is the Nikon Z6III rig build that we're going to use throughout this video. So giving you my first impression in terms of how riggable and customizable it is for the Z6III and the ZF, I like the fact that I can fit on some affordable parts in order for run and gun shooting, and also in the Nikon ZF particular case, this looks really nice. Now, I did put these cameras through a couple of different shoots, and I want to talk about what it's actually like shooting with some of these cameras while going over some of the features that are important to me, which is the whole reason why I'm making this first impressions video. But we're going to roll some B-roll.
Why do they doubt the kid? I'm about to prove them all wrong again. I got a low tolerance, cause they don't even know what the problem is. It's me. You waiting on the boy to fail, then hold your breath and face your death. Cause you play a roulette with each step I progress, no less. Go ahead and place your bets. Cause we know where we at, we know we top tier. Cause all the hate that you bring, we know it stops here. I'm taking off like a rocketeer, ain't stopping here. It's strange how they cannot.
Now, one of the first things I'm going to do with the Nikon Z6III is not only am I going to shoot in 6K NRAW, because it could do 6K NRAW, but one thing I want to test out is some of the low light footage, and as well as I haven't talked to my buddy Kevin Yeboah for a while. No relation. Now, one thing I want to test out is going to be the anamorphic support. Now, the Nikon Z6III does have internal stabilization. It just has a basic form of it, but doesn't necessarily have specific stabilization for anamorphic, which for me personally, when holding onto this gigantic rig, I'm actually okay with it. Now, another thing I want to try out was some of the low light features. So I did try using the native ISO at 800. I shot in Nikon NRAW in 6K, and as well as 24 and 60 frames a second. One of the things I want to point out in my first experience shooting this type of footage with the Nikon Z6III is the colors look really nice. Generally for me, if I'm shooting with people with darker skin, which I normally do on a regular basis, one of the things I get really turned off on, especially with new cameras, is if those skin tones look a little bit off. Now, it is nice that we're shooting in Nikon RAW. We can push and pull the colors however we like. However, in this moody low light situation, the footage looks really nice. Another thing I want to point out is that I think a couple of people had some points of contention in terms of the flickering while using it in darker areas with the Nikon NRAW. Now, in terms of being able to handle motion, putting it in a small handheld kit that I can kind of swing around in a run and gun situation, I think the form factor of this guy, I think the image quality coming out of it works really well. Now, because we are using anamorphic lenses, it's kind of tough to test out the autofocus on this guy, so we are going to do that later on in this video. However, in terms of using my Blazar Remus lenses, shooting a lot of action, which I normally do, this is an original stomping ground. If you know, you know. This is a nice test of some of the anamorphic footage with low light, but I'm going to go over to DaVinci Resolve and we're going to go a little bit deeper in terms of what it looks like in post-production. All right, so now that the shoot is over, I want to go into a little bit of the footage in terms of its low light and its anamorphic support. I'm going to try to do these things in sections, but this was just one of my favorite shots. Now, low light doesn't necessarily mean no light. You still have to use lighting. It just doesn't mean that you have a ton of lighting from the sun or a lot of ambient lighting around. Now, one thing that we did use was a Namlight 60B that's going to be on here with an unnecessarily big softbox as our key light, and as well as some RGB coming off of the Namlight 60C on a projector mount. Every other light from the ceiling lights and the lights inside of the room, those red lights, those are actually practicals. Now, clearly Nikon has the ability to shoot anamorphic footage. You just have to de-squeeze in post. So in terms of anamorphic support, I wish it was internal, but for a $2,500 hybrid camera, I don't expect too much in terms of that department. Now, one thing that I do like though is that you do have the ability to shoot in 6K in NRAW. Now, one thing people might have made a comment about, or maybe a complaint, is the fact that there was flickering and noisy shadows when using the Nikon Z6III in NRAW. Thankfully, at the time of this video, I just updated my camera, which apparently fixes both of those things. Now, for example, and the reason why I think it fixes those is because these lights are going to be practical. They're not actually rated for you to shoot video on them on professional cameras. The ceiling light and these red lights in the back are just lights that are part of the gym. I don't necessarily think they have the frequencies in terms of being able to be used on cinema cameras like you would if you had like a Namlight light, and I didn't notice any flickering here at all. One thing I also noticed too is that if I zoom all the way in, I'm not really noticing a whole lot of noise on here as well. Now, when you're shooting in RAW, you don't necessarily have noise reduction on here, but I find that if you are just exposing properly, once you put on a grade, which is pretty simple, I just had a color space transform and a built-in film look, and I changed the bluish color of that RGB light on our Namlight 60C, things look pretty dialed in and they look pretty clean. They look pretty sharp. I don't have a lot of complaints about this image, especially when working with some of the RAW. Now, we are going to do an entire video about working with RAW footage with the Nikon NRAW and DaVinci Resolve, but I just want to make a comment about that as well. You also still get some of the RAW controls here too. I could change my white balance, which in this particular situation, going lower actually made a little bit more sense. I'm going to bring this back down to where it was. I changed the tint a little bit to make sure that things were dialed in. You also get to control things like your shadows, your color boost, saturation, your midtone detail, and some of your basics, your lift, gain, and your contrast as well. Not super far dissimilar from using something like the Sony Venice, but the menus are a little bit different than if you're using something like a Red camera or a Blackmagic. But at the same time, all the controls over here are all RAW controls over that Nikon NRAW. And in terms of the low light situation, in terms of the color, because the skin tones here look great, I didn't have a skin tone node on here, that looks pretty solid. And this is what it looks like when everything's off. This is when it looks like when you just put a color space transform. This is with the film look that's on there. This is with my glow node, which actually can work a little bit in place of using a short sash everyday filter. If you want to do it in post and you don't want to buy the filter, it kind of works the same, which is just realistically just changing the blend mode to soft light and then changing your global blend a little bit. And as well as this is my color slicer to make that blue light a little bit more cyan because it contrasts with the red in the back of this frame. Now, this is a first impressions video. This is my first look at the Nikon Z6III, and there certifiably are going to be a couple of quirks with this camera, but there also might be things that are just user error, which I might have found one in terms of being able to use a monitor on this guy, but we'll just go to the clip and I'll show you what I mean. All right, so we're getting a bunch of anamorphic footage on the Nikon Z6. Now, it doesn't necessarily have anamorphic support. It doesn't do open gate. It does it in 16:9, but I could still get away with that on the Blazar Remus lenses. Now, there is something I don't like, and I'm just going to get you to come over here and check it out for a second. Now, if I go and record a clip, everything's fine, you know, the clip's recording, everything's good to go, everything's going. Once I click the record button to stop the clip, my monitor restarts and does that all over again in order to come back on, which makes it a little bit annoying because I have to wait a second every time I need to get another clip. I can't continuously press the record button over and over again. Now, I don't know if that's a setting that I have messed up. Again, I didn't really check about the specs about this thing, but that's something that might annoy me, especially whenever running gun shoot and I have to get a lot of shots. Like, so once I do this, everything's fine, it'll record the clip, but the second that I turn it off, it does that. That's kind of frustrating. Overall, I had a good first experience using the Nikon Z6III in this situation. I shoot a lot of fitness stuff, which is no surprise here. But I also want to talk about some of the photography in the Nikon ZF. Now, I did use that short stash everyday filter at a 40mm focal length, and the footage actually has great color to it. Now, I do use my own presets on Lightroom, which, I mean, if you want to check them out, you can in the link in the description down below. But in terms of being able to work with a mix of practical lights, some of the artificial lights we already brought, in terms of my first run using the Nikon ZF, especially if I had to do this for an ad campaign or someone's social media, or just the regular clients that I work with, the Nikon ZF, for a stylish little camera that doesn't have the most megapixels in the world, I think this holds up just fine, especially in a situation where there's a ton of different lights going on, a ton of moving parts, but we gotta get a little bit deeper and shoot a little bit more with both of these cameras. So we decided to take it outside. Okay, so remember when I talked about today's sponsor, Envato? Well, I'm going to talk about them a little bit more. Now, Envato is a gigantic marketplace where you can use different editing assets to make your workflow a little bit easier. You can get things like full video templates, where you can get project files, where you can actually get some of the effects without having to do the majority of the work. You can also get things like sound effects and music. You could also get things like stock images and stock footage. Now, I'm going to mention this about stock footage a little bit more because there's something that I might have wanted to do because I forgot my ND filter. I carried a 24-70 Nikon lens with me, and I forgot to bring an ND filter, or at least a step-up ring for that ND filter, and I need to get a couple more shots in order to show off what it can do, or at least establish the fact that I'm in Maui. Unfortunately, I'm not the smartest person. I didn't end up doing that, but what I can do is I can use a stock footage. I could type in Maui on Envato, and I could use that to tide over from one location to the other, so at the very least, I could finish this video. Now, if you want to make your editing workflow a little bit easier, maybe you need different editing assets, maybe you can't afford them, maybe you don't have the budget, or maybe you just don't have the skill set like I do, I'm going to leave a link in the description down below for you to try Envato today. The prices are pretty reasonable. There's a ton of different assets you can use, and if you're someone that likes to edit your videos a little bit faster, especially when you're on vacation on the other side of the world, well, you're able to do that. So special shout out to Envato for sponsoring this video, but let's talk more about the Nikon Z6III and the Nikon ZF. Okay, so shoot number 2. My buddy Brandon's actually working on a show through a marketing company in the automotive space. So myself and a couple other filmmakers took our cameras out in order to help him shoot on the day. For me in particular, I was getting a lot of the B-roll of the side-by-sides for this episode, which was a great way to test the multiple frame rates on the Nikon Z6III, while at the same time testing out some of the burst modes, some of the color outdoors, dynamic range, and as well as a little bit of rolling shutter. Now, the Nikon Z6III can shoot in 6K 60 frames a second, which we did also in the first shoot as well, but at the same time, you also can shoot up to 120 frames a second while still maintaining that NRAW codec. I'm gonna use NRAW a lot in this video. Now with NRAW, I'm gonna have a little bit more information to push and pull my image, but one thing also I wanted to keep in mind was the rolling shutter coming out of the Nikon Z6III. Now, one thing I want to reiterate is I genuinely don't know the specs of either one of these two cameras. I don't know the frame rate and burst mode. I don't know what the rolling shutter numbers are. I just know the shooting modes. I just wanted to shoot with it. But one thing that I did notice is I didn't notice any rolling shutter artifacts, which is something that most people will use in an automotive application to find out if you're going to see a little bit there. Now, again, we're still using the heavier anamorphic rig in the Nikon Z6III with my Blazar Remus lenses. So in terms of getting anamorphic stabilization, you're not necessarily going to get it here. However, the weight of the rig weighs things down in order to get some smooth handheld shots, even when shooting in 24 frames a second. In 120 frames, you could kind of mask the fact if you have jittery hands, but overall, I think the footage looked really good. Now, one thing that people mentioned was a half-stack sensor on the Nikon Z6III and how that might affect dynamic range. This is not the best example to actually demonstrate dynamic range because we had just a generally overcast day. But one thing that I will say is you had super white snow, deep black cars, and as well as you had to expose for the sky as well. So I'm going to go over to DaVinci Resolve. We're going to see what looking through some of the footage is going to look like and kind of have a first impressions, not necessarily an overall verdict, but I actually think it's going to be pretty solid. So I decided to pick a scene that has a little bit of a spectrum in terms of our luminance. I kind of wish there was more clouds in the sky. Realistically, no matter what the dynamic range was, that's what the sky looked like. But this one's a little bit underexposed. I do have to bring some of that information back, but I want to see how much I can bring back thus introducing a ton of noise. Now, again, this is the first impressions of the Nikon Z6III. I'm not super versed in Nikon cameras. I'm not super versed in Nikon RAW. I just wanted to try some things out in a variety of different scenes, and this is one of them when working with natural light where there's a little bit more shadow than I wanted, and I got to see if I could bring that information back. Now, one thing that I do wish that we had on it here is ability to change some of the ISO in post, especially because Red cameras can do that, and now Nikon owns Red, but that's nor here nor there. I'm just going to change my exposure and see what I can do here. Now we're bringing some of that back up, but you'll notice that right over here, the tire's at least far away from here. If I full screen it, you could see a little bit of that detail, but I want to see if I could bring back some of the separation between the edge of the tire and the rest of the side-by-side. I'm going to try to do that right over here. And also I'm going to see if I could bring my lift down a little bit. This is a weird dancing game that I play, and I don't even know if I'm doing it right, but I'm trying to make sure my black point still stays where it needs to be while at the same time trying to pull up any information in the darker shadows. I'm going to see if I can pull highlights down just to make sure that that sky doesn't turn completely white. And you can see this by actually looking at your scopes here. If that line starts to get flat, that's where you notice that you can't really bring any information back. But for now, this actually looks pretty decent. Now, when I go into full screen here, I do notice that I do get a little bit of noise in the black. There's a little bit of chroma noise here. There's a little bit of just little speckles here and there. But also keep in mind, we're still working with raw footage that doesn't have built-in noise reduction to begin with. So my first impressions is if I want to get rid of some of the noise, I'm just going to kind of go over here to my noise or my kind of noise reduction node. Instead of going to faster, better, enhanced, you can use ultra noise reduction. It'll give you this little box over here. We talked about this in an Ursa 12K video. And I could put this and I could find where the bullies are. And by finding where the bullies are, I could find where like the most amount of noise is. It'll take a little bit of a sample there and it'll apply the necessary noise reduction to make things look a little bit cleaner. Now, one thing you can do if you want to go back and just make sure it's not too smooth based on the noise reduction is you could actually go and you could change your sharpness, and I could change it by like 5-ish points if I want to.
So Uncle Kofi is going to teach you the Ghanaian language of the day. So because we are not in Canada today, I want to talk about something Canadian. So we feel like we are still representing home. So there's a word that we have called sankofa. Sankofa. Now, sankofa is when you have to go back and retrieve something, go back and get it. So if I tell you to sankofa, I'm telling you to go back and retrieve something from me. So I want you to sankofa to that subscribe button, sankofa to that like button. I want you to sankofa to that comment section and leave a comment. Make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. Now, Yonge and Dundas Square used to be the name of a place in Toronto, but now we have called it Sankofa instead. So now Uncle Kofi is not just on YouTube. Uncle Kofi is now in downtown Toronto. So if you want to go in Sankofa and help Uncle Kofi get to 60,000 subscribers, you have to do it today. It's very free. Free subscribing. Free subscribing. Back to the video. I'll have better words in the next one.
And also I can change my mid-tone detail and I can go to like 15 as well. That way it adds a little bit of sharpness back into here. I'm gonna let my camera have an asthma attack while it tries to render out this clip, and we're gonna show some before, some without the noise reduction, and some with it. Now on the Nikon ZF side of things, two things I wanted to test was the burst rate and its autofocus. Again, I've never used Nikon cameras before, but the autofocus and photography mode of the Nikon ZF, especially when working with fast-moving objects like side-by-sides through the dirt, was like super spot on and actually quite surprising. I actually threw this in the high-speed mode for the entire shoot in order to get some of the photos we needed to, because although we could reshoot some things, we had to keep things rolling. And the fact that the autofocus stuck on pretty decently, especially in the high burst rate mode, was super nice. Also, being able to use the burst rate mode while capturing cars was very handy as well. Now, this might be more of a basic shot, but one of the shots I wanted to get was as the side-by-side was going through the mud and going through the dirt and snow. I wanted to see that flick up and freeze that in time while still keeping the side-by-sides in focus. A matter of fact, I decided to flick on the 24-70, and there's going to be a series of photos that's only going to give you a glimpse of what exactly happened. But one of the things I wanted to get was a wide-angle kind of drive-by shot of one of the side-by-sides passing through the frame. Now, that's not to say I didn't get it, but I'm going to show you 3 photos and then I'm going to show you what some of the consequences are. Now, those 3 shots might tell the story, but I think it goes a little bit deeper. But unfortunately, I covered myself in slush, and it hurt a lot. All right, guys, so I try to get the shot at 24mm of a close-up of the cars going by. That's the camera. It still turns on. It's still good. I'm going to retire this for the day, but we're going to see how I look after trying to get the shot. So when you guys enjoy free content about these cameras, about these tools used in the field, these are the sacrifices that you have to make. I'm going to go wipe myself off now. Overall, a good shoot too. The Nikon Z6III has great frame rates, especially for a hybrid camera at that price. It has great dynamic range and color you could push and pull around in Nikon and RAW, and the Nikon ZF is no slouch if you have things that are fast-moving objects. We're going to do something a little bit more wholesome now.
So for this shoot, there isn't any tests of anything. I just wanted to bring the Z6III and the ZF for just candid moments. So we decided to go to my girlfriend's comedy show, which I go to quite a bit, and we do record a bunch of stuff for her social media. And I used the Nikon Z6III, and I didn't use Nikon RAW. I thought that was a bit overkill for this situation, but I also got some photos on the Nikon ZF as well. Both these cameras in any situation are still hybrid cameras. They can shoot photo and video pretty well, and being able to use them to capture smaller moments, because using a mirrorless camera aren't the biggest cameras in the world. But the fact that you could get the image quality out of here, we already talked about some of the low light in here, which is generally going to be the scenario, but using this for some candid moments as a everyday camera actually works out pretty well. So I promised I'd tell you guys a little bit about the accessories I had for the Nikon ZF. Now, all of the wooden accessories you see on this Nikon ZF is actually from iWood Store. I'll leave a link in the description down below. It might be a little bit overkill, especially because when you tally up the price for these accessories, it's quite a bit of money. However, using a grip on my camera is something that's become a little bit more customary for me. I have gigantic hands, so having an extra grip on a camera, no matter how small it seems to just be something that's mandatory, especially when I want to take photos comfortably. Now, speaking of comfortability and also speaking of things that look fancy, I actually took my Nikon ZF to Maui. Now, I am shooting a couple other videos, but I did sneak in my Nikon ZF in order to get some photos, and the color coming out of this camera, even with very minimal editing, I just kind of slap on a Lightroom preset that I already have, put it at 50%, and Bob's your uncle, as they would say in Canada. The colors and the image coming out of this camera looks really good. However, if you're getting things like landscape photos or you're traveling, I think this is more than enough, especially in the photography department. Okay, I think it's time to wrap up this video now. Okay, so I'm gonna wrap up this first impressions on the Z6III and the Nikon ZF. Now, for the most part, I kind of just ad-libbed different features that I wanted to test out. There was no rhyme or reason, I just wanted to try them out and see how it went. But also, we're still in Maui, so some of the things you saw was actually just part of that vacation and also part of a different video. But one thing I do want to say is that there's a ton of videos about the Z6III and the Nikon ZF, and if it fits your needs, well, then I recommend buying it. If it doesn't, well, you know, there's a ton of other cameras that you can buy as well. However, my overall experience using both of these cameras, using the Nikon Z6III for more video than anything else, and using the Nikon ZF, I think they're pretty great, and I think they're also at a great price. Now, that to be said, if some of you guys are wondering, is Kofi changing to Nikon? Absolutely not. I think in this part of my career, I'm not necessarily a team whatever brand it is. I think I'm just a camera user. And Nikon also makes cameras. They actually make really great cameras. So for the most part about this, if you're someone that likes Nikon and someone who likes some of the features in the Z6III and the ZF, absolutely great. I think my first impressions are pretty positive for both of these guys. I think they're great hybrid cameras. But at the end of the day, in terms of buying decisions and everything else, it's all up to you, what's in your wallet, and exactly what you're going to shoot. Now, I want to wrap this up because I want to enjoy the rest of my vacation. So a special shout out to you for making it to the end of this video. A special shout out to Envato for sponsoring this video. And also a special shout out to Nikon for effectively letting me keep 2 new cameras that are going to be in my kit. That being said, I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.